Hi, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Diego, physiotherapist, graduate of motor learning and control, Nordic Walking instructor at the Association of Nordic Walking Italy, ANWI. I also collaborate with Gabble, a leading company in the production of sport equipment and products for practicing Nordic Walking. I'm here today to present this online course and talk a bit about the e-poles, a new product created by the Gabble. The e-poles are digital poles that allow you to make measurements of the physical activity performed during Nordic walking. This is our 7th lecture, part of the so-called didactic. Example, educational lectures. I will also talk about teaching and management techniques to ensure your students' success, and also their motivation during physical activities, including Nordic walking. Let's start by giving a simple definition of didactics. The notion of didactics comes from the Greek and means to be inclined to teach. Teaching should be done carefully and should increase intrinsic and extrinsic motives. I've mentioned intrinsic motivation not by accident, as changing internal impulses can help to alternate our external behaviors. It's similar to planting seeds and yielding harvests later on. All of this relates to physical activity and healthy habits as well. Thus, didactics is a theory and practical application of teaching and learning. The science that defines techniques and methods to present information to students and modify their behavior as a result. When talking about teaching, we should also mention the concept of learning. Learning can be understood as the acquisition or modification of knowledge, skills, abilities, and behaviors. And as I've mentioned before, didactic methods of teaching change subjects, motives, by modifying students' cognitive and motor skills, and therefore also their behaviors. What are the right methods to teach and to learn? They include experience, practice, personal study, observation of role models, coaches, individual reasoning, or a more structured process, formal education. Learning is a crucial part of life for every human being. We can describe it as a natural process. It can be seen, for example, in the development of a newborn who is slowly learning to use his own neuromotor function in order to explore the environment around him. It is an inherent process triggered from his birth. Still, as we progress and grow up, we come across other more structured activities, such as those that are present in schools and sports clubs. And as we are talking about physical activities and motor skills, we'd better refer just to sports clubs. For example, the clubs that implement right teaching activities and create learning programs with specific goals. In this case, efforts are aimed at developing motor skills and abilities necessary for certain sport performances. Motor skills learning relate to movement expression. Authors Lee and Smith define motor learning as a set of processes associated with the practice or experience that lead to a relatively permanent change in performance of skilled behavior. It is quite important to note how this concept is explained, where the change is described as relatively permanent. In other words, learning is a constantly evolving process that leads to some kind of progress. But if not repeated or revised, progress can be lost. This point also reflects the concept of plasticity of the human being. It's especially true from the neuropsychological point of view, which explains this ever-present possibility of change, both towards knowledge acquisition through repetition and exercise, or towards losing what has been learned in case of lack of exercise. Please remember this point. Change is relatively permanent. Many skills can be taught, and many skills can remain just relatively permanent if they are not repeated enough to be consolidated and enforced. Now, let's define performance as potential ability that can be expressed by the subject in a certain contents, for instance, in sport. Let's remember the definition of teaching that we gave at the beginning: changing internal motives to change performance. But then we might wonder, how can I see the results of teaching? In other words, how do I actually see if my teaching has been successful and if it's changed the subject from the inside? Progress in motor skills can be seen through changes in performance expressed by a trained subject. This can be observed within the quality of movements as they become more precise and fluid and lead to achieving performance objectives in a stable, efficient manner without wasting too much energy. Thus, the subject is not only able to work out better, but also achieve required objectives, applying less energy, efforts, attention, therefore being less tired while achieving set goals. This also can relate to teaching. Now let's have a look at these two terms, performance and learning. They are similar and yet different. Performance refers to a certain moment. It is a temporary act which can be influenced by both fatigue and or motivation. On the other hand, learning refers to a relatively permanent change in behavior important for development of skills. A typical example, a high-level athlete. It is not possible to perform at their best throughout the year. Some athletes do perform very well. Think, for example, of a top football team player, but still it is not possible that he is always at the top of his performance throughout the whole championship. He will obviously have some good and bad matches. However, there is no doubt that he has acquired solid skills, which are quite permanent. Therefore, his abilities to express a certain motor skill or perform are also strong. We can say that performance is affected by learning. It happens thanks to constant improvement during workouts. Exercises are done better than at the beginning. Also, due to consistency, execution becomes more consistent. Acquired knowledge can be easily modified by fatigue or other conditions. Then, due to persistence, the ability to perform a skill is maintained for longer time periods. And at last, adaptability, or an ability to perform learned skills in new situations. And what is the object of learning? What does the athlete get during training? Motor skills, right? There are complex gestures that are learned during workouts until they are matrixed into muscle memory. In this regard, each coach must know teaching approaches in order to pass knowledge successfully. He needs to know how students learn. Example, base process of learning, individual learning, dispositions, and learning paces. Now let's try to give the answer to some questions. I've already mentioned how students learn, how cognitive processes stand behind motor learning. Motor skills learning is based on receiving sensory information and replying to impulses. That leads to an output such as motor action or an external response. Within the course, I will also try to give recommendations on the teaching methods regarding motor skills. I will try to answer the following questions. What's the best way to organize training workouts to maximize the athlete's progress? How to apply the most effective methods to teach and improve the sports techniques. Let's wrap up with this introductory part on motor skill teaching. In the following slides, you will learn about the required skills of the teacher, and then about underlying processes of motor learning, about various phases of motor learning, and how to identify each of them. I will also give some didactical methodological instructions in order to prepare your athletes better. From a neuropsychological point of view, we know that underlying processes of motor learning are impacted by perception, by the athlete's ability to receive and react to sensory stimuli of a different nature. These stimuli are a sort of input that activates an athlete's attention. In fact, they reach the person's nervous system, which then triggers the reaction to them. These stimuli must occur fairly often and last over some time to be embedded into the memory of a person in order to launch the learning process. Perception, in its turn, is a process that examines sensory data to give it meaning. Data comes through sensory organs, which are able to perceive and react to stimuli of different nature. Example, visual, auditory, mechanical, tactile, or even emotional. Thanks to the sense organs, receptors that stimuli can be processed and transformed into electrical nerve impulses that travel to the nervous system, get decoded and become clear for a person himself. Senses are often divided into external and internal sensory systems. External senses are based on various sensory organs that collect information about the world outside. And internal senses identify stimuli from the inside internal organs and tissues. When we talk about external sense organs that analyze external changes in the environment, we must mention the main senses humans have. One of them, certainly vision. Sense of vision provides us with the vital information on the world around us and the changes that occur there. The next one is hearing, the ability to perceive sounds. It also provides us with a possibility. It also provides us with a possibility to communicate with others through sounds, to hear and listen to them. Then the sense of touch. It is also crucial for us. This is our tactile sense that allows us to interpret temperature, texture, shapes. Talking about the internal sensory system, we should mention proprioception, also known as the sense of self-movement. Such sense organs as muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, joint receptors contribute to our sense of self-movement. They play an important role in regulating contractions and decontractions of muscles. And a good work of muscles affects the fluidity of our movements. We also have more control over our fast, precise, and coordinated movements. Another important structure that's linked with interoception is the vestibular apparatus. Its main function is maintaining balance. It controls the motion and head position, accelerations and deaccelerations, and the spatial orientation, and thanks to it, can coordinate muscle contractions and body's directions. It also ensures correct posture of the subject and helps maintain an upright position. Besides being crucial in learning for stimuli receptions, input processing, these sensory systems help to analyze outputs, results of motor skills. They are essential as they allow us to prepare the movement, and once it is started, to monitor its execution, evaluate its final outcome. Thanks to interaction and integration of various sensory neurons, our mind is able to summarize neuropsychological and neurobiological responses, which help us perceive the sense of movement. Another aspect regarding motor skills learning is attention. Edwards defines it as cognitive process of concentrating on specific sensory stimuli. Attention has a couple of important characteristics, which are selectivity and attention span. Selectivity refers to the fact that our attention is limited. That means you cannot react to many stimuli at the same time, and that attention can be shifted from one stimulus to another. Therefore, selectivity of attention means selecting particular information, prioritizing certain stimuli, and ignoring others. We can distinguish two types of attention, incidental and intentional. Incidental one means that something unexpectedly attracts interest of the subject. Often this is viewed in a negative way, as it distracts the subject from what he or she is doing. And intentional attention is instead controlled by the will of the subject. The coach should try to help cultivate this student's ability to pay attention to specific things deliberately. That's the one of the coach's essential task to help students identify essential elements of the technique to which they should intentionally pay attention. If we talk about the concept of attention span, we must mention concentration. Concentration is the ability to focus attention on one activity or thought over a period of time. Our attentional focus could be either internal or external. For example, when the athlete is thinking about execution of certain activity and feelings that the result from this activity, we talk about internal attentional focus. And we talk about external focus when our athlete pays attention to external stimuli, such as changes in the world outside, for example. Basically, external attentional focus tends to determine a better performance. This is especially true for experienced athletes who have already mastered the execution of techniques and therefore can modify their performance according to different external situational factors. On the other hand, the internal focus is relevant during the initial stages of learning, as the subject directs his attention towards the internal perception, which often leads to correction of mistakes and improvement of sports performance. Another fundamental aspect that influences learning is memory, or rather, memory systems. Sensory neurons of afferent neurons from outside or inside can be retained and used afterwards thanks to our memory system. You can compare memory systems with warehouses of different sizes where processed information stimuli are stored and can be reused in the future. Memory is not static, but dynamic. It includes phases of data registration. It's stored and the future retrieval of collected information. It allows the body to retain past experiences. Memory is one of the main aspects of evolution and survival of species. It's also the basis of any learning. As I mentioned, we must speak not of memory, but rather of memory systems. They can be seen as a sort of multi-level structures that are able to keep information in different ways. There is an immediate memory that resembles pretty much a sensory warehouse. As our sense organs receive lots of stimuli outside and inside of our body, these stimuli carry important information, which then is processed and maintained in our immediate memory for a short time. Later, this information undergoes a selection process carried out by attention. Attention works as a filter, able to determine what information is important, worthy to be saved in other memory systems, and what information should be discarded. Information that is considered relevant passes to a short-term memory, which has a limited retention capacity, also known as storage. Psychology refers to this span in short-term memory as 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information, kept for a limited time, about a minute. Repeated information is then kept in a conscientious way. Our attention passes it to the next level. If it is not processed and filtered by attention, it's quickly lost. If information makes it possible to perceive phases, it may enter so-called long-term memory. It resembles a large container that stores our motor and cognitive skills for a relatively long time. Regarding motor skills, keeping learned motor skills is particularly easy for those cyclical activities. Think of a cyclist, a marathon runner, a swimmer who carries out repetitive activities, whose perfection of technique is achieved thanks to repetitions. On the other hand, think of the choreography of a dancer, a gymnast. Their movements will not be the same because there will be other elements to add, to change, and learn. As people say, practice makes perfect. The opposite is also true. If a task is performed rarely, it will be quickly forgotten. As we said before, 3 memory systems are not separate parts, but an integral unit. Every system is dynamic and represents an important phase in learning. In this part, we've learned about the processes underlying motor skills training, and how subjects perceive stimuli, which are then filtered and stored in various memory systems. Now let's touch upon various stages of motor skills learning. Briefly describe two main theoretical approaches, which differ mainly on perception and talk about the link between perception and action. The first is a cognitive approach. The approach assumes the presence of centralized mechanisms for processing information by human nervous system, and also existence of internal general motor programs, which control our motions. Central nervous system is similar to a computer, where the brain receives information from an internal external environment, elaborates it, and generates a response according to the input. Response goes through these successive phases. 1, perception of stimuli. 2, decision making, choosing the most suitable motor response. And at last, 3, response programming suited to the environment. The second one is a dynamic approach. It explains perception as a direct mechanism. Example, the person doesn't use his memory in various programs, but immediately identifies information within the present conditions and acts. This approach is based on a theory of dynamic systems, where learning appears directly from interactions between different body systems and environment, thus leading to a direct link between perception and action. It does not pay much attention to the cognitive process of the nervous system, nor the use of memory. In reality, even though these two approaches can seem contradictory, they actually complement each other. Both of them help explain the complexity of processes that underlie our abilities to learn and react with particular movements. Neither approach is able to fully explain learning. Still, the coach should know both approaches to use them for teaching his trainees. Regardless of the chosen approach, that there are always 3 successful stages of skill acquisition, that is, from an initial to advanced performance. The initial phase is cognitive stage, followed by the so-called associative stage, and finally, an autonomous stage. Transition from one stage to another is quite subtle. During each of them can be different and depends on characteristics of the subject and the complexity of the task. There are different possible phases in these stages, and regression in learning is also possible. In the first cognitive stage, the beginner struggles with the difficulties of a new task. The main problem is to understand the goals and what to do to accomplish them. Performance at this stage is characterized by frequent errors. The subject tries a series of movements in order to achieve its goal and to move correctly. Often they see that they can't correct themselves. They have a rough idea about the task. Movements are inaccurate and are not fluid. Feelings derived from movements are confusing and poorly understood. The trainee at this stage tries to fulfill tasks while using a sort of internal verbalization, as if he or she were talking to himself, guiding himself or herself to carry out the actions. At this stage, trainees often make a lot of mistakes as they are a bit distracted. They can easily lose interest in what they're doing, and thus it is certainly very important for the coach to help ignite this interest and motivation. The good news is that this stage is quite swift. Learning basic elements is generally quite fast, and the progress is superior in comparison to the other learning stages. The last is true, as skills to acquire are relatively simple. At the next, the associative stage, the athlete understands the task better. His or her technique improves. The movements are more accurate, regular, and fluid. At this stage, kinesthetic awareness improves. The subject gets better internal feedback, better connections from his senses within the performance. And obviously, from mechanical and energetic points of view, movement become more efficient. Verbalization, our internal friend who is talking, loses importance. Performance has less errors. It is more accurate technique, improves and now closer to than required. Movements become a bit faster. Some of them are already memorized. At this stage, a person tries to adapt to changes in the environment. At this stage, performance is much better. It's executed smoothly, given the fact that there is a good environment for its execution. Mistakes are often typical and are made due to unexpected difficulties. Still, when the athlete faces an unknown environment and some changes, performance begins to decline. Progress at this stage is a bit slow and more systematic in comparison with previous stage. A person can get stuck here a little longer. It is not uncommon for an athlete to stay at this stage without a speedy progress to the next stage. The third stage of learning is so-called autonomous stage. It is described by a large amount of practice, or better to say, it is a point that it is reached after lots of practice. This is a never-ending stage, as there is always room for perfection. It is characterized by the subject's ability to execute controlled movements, and his or her technique is well embedded. Performance is carried out in a safe way with good efficiency from an energetic point of view. Smooth and fast movements do not require careful and detailed planning and coordination, trying thinking. Some changes in the environment can't impact the whole performance. Great technique knowledge prevents the athlete from making errors as the subject recognizes correct execution and is able to self-correct. At this stage, there is a shift of internal attention, internal verbalization, towards external stimuli. This gives the subject the possibility of proving his performance within occasional environmental stimuli. Obviously, as mentioned before, the stage requires many hours of practice, polishing sports techniques, and exercising a high workload. The athlete must be highly motivated, and certainly the coach should support him at this stage. I'm going to end here this part of the lecture describing various learning phases, cognitive and dynamic approaches. Now, let's talk about how to manage or monitor these phases and also influence students' progress in these phases. Let's break down the first cognitive stage I mentioned. At this stage, we notice the first problems that the beginner struggles with. The athlete receives a basic idea of the skills he or she has to acquire. He or she also starts to understand better the objectives and how they can be achieved. Here, the instructor needs to support and encourage him a lot. Even if the goal is clear, the athlete can perform poorly. The person can understand what he or she needs to do, but still be confused about the exact movements that he or she needs to execute. He or she also might be confused about internal and external stimuli and how to encode and use them in order to improve his workout or her workout, to see where to pay more attention. One of the major challenges of this phase is control of muscles and joints involved in movements. When the athlete learns a new movement, he or she needs to master control over movements and start understanding from the neuropsychological point of view what he or she should do, which muscles or joints to move and which ones to block. Intervention of the coach can be expressed through verbal instruction, visual gestures, and demonstrations, direct corrections of technique, and verbal feedback. All this helps the athlete to build and form a mental image of the right movement or motor skill. Often to overcome challenges, the beginner starts using so-called subvocal verbalizations, self-instructions, mentally repeating the information he or she has just received to allow step-by-step control of the actions. This is a spontaneous strategy useful for initial stages of learning. What are the practical recommendations at this stage? For example, If you want to make learning easier for your student, you can reduce the number of body structures to control, eliminate some parts of movement. This can help to reach a favorable condition to reach the necessary technique. The coach should include both verbal instructions, also illustrations and practical demonstrations that can ignite the student's imagination. Both help focus his or her attention on relevant information in order to improve their performance. These demonstrations can, for instance, be based on already acquired skills, so students make similarities with a new technique. Another critical aspect is trying to maintain a high level of motivation, as it's easy to become frustrated at this stage. In the next associative stage, the subject begins to better understand the idea of techniques, how to improve it. Acquired movements become more elaborate and lay the basis for the future movements. This also gives the subject the possibility to direct attention to other key and technical points and avoid a continuous internal control over the performance as the previous state. The subject starts perceiving more information from diverse channels and combines them. Performance becomes more richer and diverse, resembling the mosaic and with a greater number of puzzles. The so-called kinesthetic awareness also is very important here. It gives information to the subject about his own execution and thus increases precision of movements. The athlete starts to understand and integrate relevant information from the outside world. The focus should be exactly on connecting sensory stimuli and following motor responses within various situations. For example, the subject starts to show the ability to modify temporal characteristics of movements according to situations, accelerate or slow down his movements. From the didactic point of view, it will be more important to help the athlete to identify situational changes and respond to them properly, rather than constantly giving information about his or her performance. It's quite helpful to gradually modify the variable factors such as different paces of performance or ask, for example, to react differently to unexpected stimuli. In the long run, this can help reduce the time of producing a response to stimuli. Therefore, the subject will no longer waste much of his or her mental energy and perform faster. The coach now begins to progressively minimize his feedback, as the subject should develop the ability to evaluate his or her own performance, to report his or her own problems. It's more useful at this stage to describe personal sensations connected to performance in order to support introspection of movements. There are much less errors at this stage, and direct positive feedback must be given about the correct movements during the practice. Now let's move to the last stage, autonomous learning. At this stage, the athlete has better coordination of movements. The subject can perform movements with various factors: speed, amplitude of movements, reaction to environmental stimuli. At this stage, the ability to perform has become almost automatic. The subject no longer needs to think much about how to execute his or her movements. He or she doesn't think about the changes in the world around him or her, much so as he or her can perform complex movements without ruminating about its execution and distracting him or herself if there are various changes around him or her. He or she is able to shift their attention to other information. Feelings and sensations he or she perceives are much more clear and align better with explanations given by the coach. There is a great ability of self-control, self-correction in order to achieve an expected result. Mental work and perception of movements are often automatic, and it can allow one to focus attention on the environment. At this level, the athlete is able to make the most internal-external resources to improve his or her workout. For example, exploiting the physical characteristics of the environment, such as inertia, gravity, etc. everything that helps to achieve better results. However, it is worth noticing that progress at this stage is slow, minimal, and in the long run, this slowness can lead to frustration and loss of motivation. To avoid it, the coach has to support and motivate his athlete as workloads start to be a little more significant from technical as well as a physical point of view. It is important to incorporate exercises in different environments, add small obstacles, and all those situations that can stimulate the subject to adapt his or her technique. The goal is to provide additional challenges in order to try to expand the athlete's ability to adapt. In this graph, you'll see representation of learning stages with various points where skill and knowledge are being developed. In the first stage, skills are acquired rapidly. In the following stage, the curve tends to flatten out a bit. Speed to acquire new skills and techniques slow down. In autonomous stage, the curve seems to stop rising. Changes are very subtle, and reaching greater progress requires even greater practice training. Therefore, the learning curve is a noticeable slowdown. Here we will talk about memory and attention skills and how it relates to age. As we've explained before, attention to performance is an important feature, as well as memory, our ability to retain information that helps learning. You can see that these two aspects are intertwined. They begin to develop starting from childhood. They reach a peak in adulthood and progressively slow down as we age. This is certainly an aspect from the tactile point of view, and we must always keep it in mind, considering the state and the age of the subjects we are working with in order to train them well. When we talk about perception, there are different sensory channels with which the subject perceives information stimuli better. Visual images are certainly one of the main and most common stimuli that play a huge role in learning. Instead of the ability to perceive internal stimuli, the stimuli that derive as feedback to movements are more complicated and can be met more often in the advanced phases of perception of movements. From the tactical point of view, it is useful to know the following subdivisions, as not all subjects use the same channels effectively. There are visuals who learn extremely well through observation. They need to observe technique with their own eyes. The coach and different images could be their role models. There are also audios, which learn better with verbal information, so they need feedback from their coach who can help build and detain image of movements using his words. They are also quite sensitive, for example, to changes in tone of voice and speed of communication. There are also kinesthetics who learn more just by moving, by touching, thus using a practical dynamic approach to explore performance. They need to do something in order to get feedback during the performance itself. Taking into consideration this group division of various sensory channels, among people, it is crucial to try to use all of these ways during training. Therefore, it will be important to explain something using verbal information or to give practical demonstrations, illustrations, and rely on some kinetic tactile techniques. Engage all of these ways during training to boost performance of your trainee. First, show some techniques in a static phase and then try to insert them into training. And always put the student in a friendly environment and then start bringing necessary changes in. For instance, movement, amplitude, variety, inertia, and so on. When we talk about learning, we might come across a term related to motivation, a pivotal factor that gives the subject the possibility to learn, work out better. This fundamental component linked to motivation in sports is enjoyment. Example, feeling of happiness, pleasure, well-being that appears from practicing a physical activity, or Nordic walking. Let me remind you that the word sport derives from Latin and means to amuse oneself by actively exercising in the open air or taking part in some game. All these activities that made citizens leave their houses to take part in recreation activities. Thus, happiness aspect, well-being is certainly important in any physical activity. Over time, the term sport appeared in various countries and is always associated with leisure, recreational activities. The word motivation, on the other hand, derives from motus, which refers to movement, directing a subject towards something, or object, or goal. Therefore, motivation is linked to achievement of something. It is certainly important for the instructor to set goals, to stimulate motivation, and also know reasons that induce the individual to perform better. As we have said, as one trains more, the speed of progress becomes slower. Thus, a trainee needs more and more motivation to achieve better results. There are various reasons, physiological and psychological, which can reinforce motivation. For example, such goals as losing weight, reducing fat mass, getting into better shape while exercising in nature, relieving stress, back pain, and rigidity of the body, improving flexibility, posture, and body control, and consequently gaining confidence, greater balance, and reducing fatigue. The physiosocial aspects include being in nature, breathing fresh air, outdoor socializing, finding company, relieving work stress, and being disconnected from work a bit, and also having fun while doing sports. And on the final note, that concludes my lecture today. Thank you so much for your attention and time.